Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The city of Lagos was a restless animal that never seemed to sleep, with its restless horns blaring into the night, street vendors still calling out their wares even at odd hours, and the unending beat of footsteps pounding pavements like an eternal drum. In the midst of this sprawling chaos lived Clara, a woman whose life was stitched as tightly as the seams she sewed for a living. She worked in a tailoring shop wedged between a phone accessories kiosk and a fried yam stand, where the air was forever thick with a blend of hot oil and the sharp tang of machine grease. Her life was simple, and though not rich in wealth, it was honest. Her fingers bore the marks of needles and scissors, but she carried those scars with pride, because in a city that often swallowed people whole, she had found a way to remain upright and steady. She lived alone in a modest one-room apartment tucked inside a crowded block in Surulere, where the neighbors fought over generator noise and water bills, yet somehow shared laughter in the same breath. It was here, amid the hammering noise of Lagos survival, that she crossed paths with James. He was a mechanic, tall with the kind of easy smile that made people forgive his lateness or debts, a man known to charm customers even when their cars left his garage still coughing smoke. Clara first saw him when her neighbor's tricycle broke down, and James arrived with oil-stained overalls and an energy that filled the street. Their conversation had been brief, nothing more than polite greetings, yet something about his gaze lingered in her mind longer than the sound of her sewing machine. From then, she noticed him often, sometimes leaning against cars, other times shouting to his apprentices, his laughter rolling over the sound of clanging spanners. Life in Lagos had hardened her enough to distrust such men, yet in quiet moments she wondered if perhaps kindness could be hidden beneath his ruggedness. The days stretched into weeks, and their paths crossed again and again, until recognition grew into friendship, and the rhythms of their lives began to weave threads across each other like a half-finished cloth waiting for design. Clara's routine was not glamorous, but it was steady, and in a city where steady felt like a miracle, she clung to it like a raft in turbulent waters. Every morning, she rose before dawn, filled a small kettle, boiled water, and poured herself a quick bath in the tiny bathroom shared by 3 tenants. By 7, she was on a Danfo bus, squeezed between strangers who smelled of perfume, sweat, and hope, all heading into the city's belly. She worked through the day cutting fabrics, measuring customers who argued about prices, smiling even when exhaustion weighed on her like a heavy sack of rice. In those moments, James's occasional visits were a break in her monotony. Sometimes, he would bring a broken zipper and pretend he didn't know how to fix it, just to talk to her. Other times, he would lean against the doorframe, watching her stitch as if her work were a kind of magic. Slowly, the conversation deepened beyond jokes. They talked about their struggles, about dreams too large for their pockets, about the weight of Lagos living. Clara confessed she wanted her own fashion house someday, while James spoke of leaving roadside repairs and owning a large workshop where people would bring cars from all over the city. Their laughter carried above the din of traders shouting, "Madam, buy your cloth here," and apprentices begging for sachet water. Even the bustle around them seemed to soften in those moments. Clara did not yet call it love. It was too early for such a heavy word. But she knew something had begun to grow, like a seed pushing stubbornly through cracked concrete, reaching for the light. Though she kept her guard up, she found herself waiting for his visits, replaying their conversations when she lay alone at night listening to the endless quarrels and laughter of her neighbors. The turning point came one humid evening, when Lagos's usual madness pressed on every corner. The buses were snarled in traffic, their conductors hanging dangerously from doors, shouting insults that rolled over each other like crashing waves. Clara was heading home, tired, her mind still busy with unfinished work, when she heard someone calling her name. She turned and saw James running toward her, but before she could wave, his body crumpled like paper against the roadside. The sound of people shouting, "Somebody help!" pierced the air. She rushed to him, her heart thundering against her ribs, and knelt beside him. His face was pale, his lips trembling, his breathing shallow, as if his lungs were failing to catch the air around them. In seconds, a crowd gathered Lagos style, half of them offering advice, the other half gawking as if tragedy were a street show. With trembling hands, Clara hailed a Kiki, and with the help of 2 strangers, she dragged James inside and rode to the nearest hospital. The city outside kept moving, horns blaring, hawkers still chasing customers, lovers still strolling, unaware that within her arms, a man's life was slipping like water through a sieve. At the hospital, doctors rushed him into the emergency ward, words like complication and urgent surgery slicing through her like blades. The cost, they said, was staggering, more than any tailor in Surelier could ever save in years of toil. Clara's knees buckled. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Yet, even as tears pooled in her eyes, she knew one thing for certain. She could not let him die. The city had taught her harshness, but her heart still held softness enough to fight for him. The following days became a blur of desperate motions, each step weighted with fear. Clara pawned her mother's old earrings, the only inheritance left from a woman who had died too soon. She sold her prized sewing machine, the one that had carried her through countless sleepless nights, the hum of its motor now replaced with silence that echoed in her empty shop. She borrowed from friends, swallowing her pride to knock on doors she once vowed never to approach. Even her landlord, who often shouted about late rent, gave her a little, muttering about God's mercy. Piece by piece, coin by coin, she gathered enough to meet the doctor's demands. Her nights were spent staring at the cracked ceiling of her room, whispering prayers into the dark, listening to the city's restless noise outside, cars racing, radios blaring, neighbors quarreling, and wondering if James would live to see another sunrise. When the surgery was finally performed, she sat outside the theater with her head pressed into her palms, her heart beating faster than the ticking wall clock. The hours crawled like wounded soldiers until finally a doctor emerged, wiping his brow and saying words she would never forget. He made it. Clara's body gave way to relief, tears flooding her face. In that moment, exhaustion melted into joy. She had wrestled death and won, not for herself, but for the man whose smile had once lit up a crowded street corner. James's recovery was not a story written in sudden miracles, but in slow hours that stretched like the never-ending Lagos traffic on a Monday morning. The first days after the surgery were filled with sharp smells of disinfectant, nurses hurrying with trays, and the unsteady rhythm of his breath that made Clara sit at the edge of her chair, whispering silent prayers with every rise and fall of his chest. She carried food in small bowls from her apartment, jollof rice wrapped carefully in foil, pepper soup sealed in plastic, soft bread tucked into cloth, because she didn't trust hospital meals to keep him nourished. Each time she uncovered her offerings, James's eyes, still heavy with fatigue, softened in a gratitude that words failed to capture. She would sit close, adjusting the pillows behind him, spooning broth into his mouth slowly, as though afraid the world might shatter if she rushed. When visiting hours ended and the nurses forced her out, she often lingered in the hallway, peering through the glass of the ward before finally making the long ride home in the clamorous Danfo buses where strangers argued about politics, traffic, and the price of Gary. Lagos was loud, restless, and impatient, yet Clara carried within her a quiet determination that gave her strength each dawn to repeat the journey back to the hospital. On some nights, when James could barely speak, he would hold her hand tightly, a silent squeeze that said more than promises ever could, and she found herself believing that maybe sacrifice could indeed build the foundation of love. As weeks turned into months, James grew stronger, first walking with the help of nurses, then managing on his own, his steps shaky like a child learning to walk. Clara was there at every milestone, her applause loud in the sterile hallways where patients and visitors often turned to smile at her joy. When the day of discharge finally arrived, Clara was the one who signed the last documents, gathered his meager belongings into a faded duffel bag, and escorted him into the bright Lagos sun. He moved back into his one-room apartment in Surelier, where the ceiling fan rattled with every turn, and the bathroom door creaked as though complaining of neglect. Clara helped him settle in, scrubbing the floor tiles, changing the bedspread, stocking his tiny fridge with groceries she could barely afford. She became a presence in his home, often rushing over after hours at her tailoring shop, still carrying chalk stains on her fingers and threads tangled on her clothes, just to cook him meals and ensure he was regaining strength. On weekends, when the city lights glittered across the lagoon and the streets of Victoria Island swelled with laughter, Clara and James would find quieter spots. A small suya stand where the meat sizzled over open flames, or the marina where they sat watching boats rock gently against the pier. Clara allowed her imagination to drift during these moments. She saw herself beside him in a more permanent way, perhaps in a small wedding gown stitched by her own hands, with the sounds of their laughter blending with the city's heartbeat. Each step forward filled her with hope, and she believed with a childlike certainty that their story was heading toward a future too beautiful to question. Time, however, is a painter that reveals more than it hides, and as James resumed work at the garage, Clara began to notice the subtle strokes of change in his behavior. At first it was small. The late evenings he explained away with extra work, the phone calls he excused himself to take, the sudden need for privacy in a life that had once been an open book. Clara, with her gentle heart, told herself these were signs of a man rebuilding his life, and she refused to press too hard, like a seamstress who chooses to overlook a crooked stitch for the sake of peace. Yet inside, unease gnawed at her, the kind that keeps one awake at night listening to the distant honk of trailers on the expressway. James's smile, once warm and unguarded, became guarded, practiced, as though he was performing a role rather than living it. Sometimes when Clara visited the garage, she caught him stepping aside too quickly, his voice softening into secrecy as he ended calls. But whenever she asked, he kissed her forehead and murmured, "You worry too much, my Clara. I'm just trying to make things better for us." His words were honey poured over rust, sweet on the surface but incapable of hiding the decay beneath. She swallowed her doubts, convincing herself that love required patience, and that a woman must sometimes look past shadows to preserve the light she cherished. Yet Lagos has a way of whispering truths that cannot be silenced. The city streets spoke in fragments, strangers gossiping in buses, friends exchanging half-heard rumors, neighbors throwing careless comments that pricked like thorns. Clara heard bits and pieces, not enough to form a complete picture but too pointed to ignore. Still, she held on to her dream, stitching her faith together like a fragile garment that unraveled with every tug, yet somehow still held. She cooked for him, ironed his clothes, and sat with him on nights when the power went out, fanning him with folded newspapers while they laughed about Nipa's stubbornness. She convinced herself that every sacrifice she made was an investment in their shared future, that her love could withstand the city's temptations and distractions. At moments when doubt clawed at her heart, she recalled the hospital days, his trembling hand in hers, and his voice whispering gratitude so raw it felt eternal. She believed that a man saved from death would never risk the love that had been his lifeline. But beneath her faith, beneath her tireless devotion, a storm was gathering, quiet yet relentless, waiting for its moment to break. City of Lagos is a restless mouth, always speaking, always chewing on people's secrets, spitting them out as gossip in bus stops, market stalls, and hair salons. Clara learned this the hard way. One hot Saturday afternoon, she had gone to Balagan Market to buy fabric for a new customer when she overheard two women laughing by a stall, their voices sharp like broken glass. They spoke of a man at a popular garage in Suralere who was spending too much time with a young woman, known for her flamboyant style and booming laugh. Clara's heart froze when she recognized James's name woven casually into their banter, and then Melissa's, spoken like a punchline. She stood rooted by the rolls of Ankara cloth, pretending to inspect patterns, but her ears burned as she caught every detail. The rooftop dinners in Victoria Island, the shopping sprees at Acacia Mall, the whispers of their hands locked as they walked boldly through crowded streets. The market noise, the haggling, the clanging of coins, the sellers screaming prices, suddenly felt like a cruel drumbeat pounding into her chest. Clara forced herself to buy the fabric, to keep her face calm, but her heart was a trembling bird trapped inside her ribs. By the time she boarded a Danfo back to her neighborhood, the city outside the bus window blurred, its colors and lights smearing into one endless smear of betrayal. She sat still among strangers who argued about fuel scarcity, trying not to weep, but every pothole on the road seemed to shake loose another piece of her trust. When she finally arrived home and locked her apartment door behind her, the silence inside her tiny room was heavier than the chaos she had escaped outside. Days passed with Clara struggling to cage the storm that now roared within her. She carried on with her tailoring as though nothing had changed, taking customers' measurements, smiling faintly, handing out change with steady hands, but inside her soul trembled like Lagos lagoon waters in harmattan wind. Each night when she lay on her narrow bed, the whispers returned, clearer than before, James laughing with Melissa, James holding her hand in crowded places, James spending on another woman when Clara was still repaying debts from his surgery. The walls of her apartment seemed to echo those rumors until sleep became a stranger. Finally, one evening when James stopped by her place, smiling too easily, smelling faintly of cologne he had never worn before, Clara could no longer hold her silence. Her voice, usually soft as cotton, cracked like dry wood as she asked him directly if he was seeing another woman. For a moment his eyes darted away, searching the air for excuses, but she pressed harder, her body trembling. He denied it at first, weaving words that sounded more like rehearsed lines than truth, but her tears betrayed her pain. She broke down completely, her sobs raw like a wound touched by salt. James, seeing her shattered, fell to his knees on the tiled floor of her room, clasping her hands with desperate force. "Clara, I swear it was nothing," he said, his voice low, almost broken. "You're the one I love. You saved me, and I can never forget that. I will change. Please don't leave me." His eyes, glistening, seemed to plead with the sincerity of a drowning man reaching for air, and though every nerve in Clara's body screamed caution, her heart, battered and bleeding, still longed to believe him. She held him tightly that night, whispering prayers that his words would grow roots and bloom into truth. For a while after that confrontation, Clara convinced herself the storm had passed. James began calling more often, picking her up from work, even bringing her small gifts, a wristwatch, a scarf, takeaway meals from restaurants she had never visited. He acted as though he were trying to sew back the torn fabric of their love, and Clara, weary from suspicion, let herself rest in that comfort. They shared evenings again at his apartment, cooking meals together while music floated from a neighbor's radio. Clara found herself smiling more, even laughing, though the memory of Melissa still lurked at the back of her mind like a shadow that never disappears in daylight. When James kissed her forehead and promised her the world, she wanted so badly to trust him, to silence the gnawing whispers of the city. Yet Lagos is a city that never sleeps, and neither do its rumors. At the salon one afternoon, while women waited their turn under hairdryers, Clara once again heard James's name linked with Melissa's, the words wrapped in laughter too loud to ignore. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to smile as though she had heard nothing. On her way home, she told herself that people talked too much, that jealousy could poison tongues, but when she reached her apartment, she could not bring herself to eat. She sat staring at her sewing machine, the threads of doubt tangling endlessly in her mind. It was as if the city itself was conspiring to pull the veil from her eyes, and each attempt to hold it shut grew weaker with time. Still, Clara clung to the memories of the hospital days, of James's frailty and gratitude, of the whispered promises she believed had been etched in stone. She told herself that perhaps the rumors exaggerated, that people always embellished stories to make them more entertaining. She tried to remember his desperate kneeling, his tearful apology, the way he had begged her forgiveness as though life itself depended on her answer. In her heart, she repeated that people can change, that a man rescued from the edge of death would not throw away the woman who saved him. Yet the unease never left her, creeping into her dreams, shadowing her waking hours. Lagos, with its neon lights, crowded bars, and unending buzz, seemed to mock her faith at every corner. Each Danfo bus ride carried voices too eager to share tales of betrayal. Each market visit reminded her that no secret survives long in a city where walls have ears and streets have tongues. Clara tried to silence the noise, but her spirit trembled. She wanted to believe, yet the foundation of trust had cracked, and she sensed, deep down, that her story with James was not healing but unraveling. The thought haunted her. Perhaps the greatest betrayal is not the lie told, but the hope clung to in the face of the obvious truth. Clara's discovery came on a quiet evening, when the sky above Lagos was painted in fading orange, and the sound of impatient horns rose from the streets like a chorus of frustration. She had gone to James's apartment as she often did, carrying a plastic bag of yam flour and vegetables, intending to prepare dinner after his long day at the garage. He wasn't home yet, and she busied herself tidying his room, folding shirts left carelessly on the chair, and sweeping away dust that had gathered in corners. It was while putting away his laundry that her hand brushed against the inside pocket of his denim jacket. A folded piece of paper slipped out and landed silently on the floor. She bent to pick it up, expecting a mechanic's receipt or some work note, but when her eyes scanned the bold letters printed across the top, her breath caught. It was an airline ticket. She unfolded it fully and saw not one, but two. One bore James's name, the other Melissa's. The destination was London. The date was in 3 days. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the bed, staring at the tickets until her vision blurred. The walls of the small apartment seemed to close in on her, and the fan's noisy blades above her head sounded like mocking laughter. Every sacrifice she had made, the jewelry sold, the loans taken, the nights of exhaustion, all of it had led to this moment of betrayal sealed in ink. She clutched the tickets with trembling hands, her heart thudding like a drum. The man she had saved from death's grip was planning to abandon her for another woman, to vanish across the ocean and leave her broken in a city that devoured the weak without mercy. That night, Clara returned to her own apartment in Sur-Île with the tickets folded tightly in her handbag, as though holding them close could contain the storm raging inside her. She did not switch on the light immediately. She simply sat in the darkness, listening to the hum of generators from neighboring flats, the occasional cry of a baby, and the distant laughter of youths on the street below. Her mind replayed every moment of their story, the hospital days when his hand clung to hers, the tearful promises in her room, the laughter they once shared over suya on warm nights. Each memory now felt like glass pressed into her chest, sharp and unbearable. She asked herself how a man whose very life had been bought with her sweat and sacrifices could repay her with such calculated betrayal. The silence of the room was suffocating, so she opened her window and gazed at the Lagos night. The city sparkled with lights, restless and unrepentant, as though mocking her pain. She whispered to herself in broken phrases, asking questions no one would answer. Why, James? Why repay love with cruelty? Tears slid down her cheeks freely, yet beneath the flood of sorrow, something stronger stirred. It was not hatred, nor even vengeance, but a fierce determination that he would not walk away without facing her. She thought of her debts, of the dignity stripped from her when she begged for money to save him, of the sleepless nights she endured. No, James would not leave her with nothing. She rose from her bed in the darkness and whispered, "If he wants to fly, then he must first pay for the wings he borrowed." The following days were heavy, each hour dragging across her shoulders like a sack of stones. Clara still went to her shop, measured fabrics, cut cloth, and greeted customers with faint smiles, but inside she lived in another world. Her mind replayed the confrontation she knew must come, rehearsing what she might say, how she might hold her ground without breaking down in tears. She avoided James deliberately, ignoring his calls, inventing excuses when he suggested meeting. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the noise of the city seeped through her thin walls. Hawkers crying their last sales, buses rumbling into the night, generators buzzing like persistent insects. Each sound reminded her she was still here, still fighting for air in a city that never paused to console the wounded. Once, she held the tickets in her hand again, staring at Melissa's name printed clearly, and she felt a wave of nausea. It was one thing to suspect betrayal, it was another to see it documented on crisp paper. She wondered if Melissa knew the truth of the money used to save James, if she had any idea of the woman who had bled to keep him alive. The thought stung, but Clara told herself she was not the one who should feel shame. She had given honestly, loved sincerely, and if her kindness had been thrown aside, it was not her heart that was cheap but his. This clarity strengthened her resolve. She began to sketch in her mind the steps she would take, imagining herself confronting him not in private, where he could twist his lies again, but in a place where escape would be impossible. Her plan, fragile yet firm, began to take shape like fabric pinned carefully before the first cut. When the morning of the third day arrived, Lagos woke as it always did, horns blaring on Ojalegba Bridge, buses packed with workers, vendors calling out with weary voices. But for Clara, the city felt sharper, brighter, more dangerous. She knew it was the day James would try to vanish with Melissa, and she felt the weight of time pressing on her shoulders. She dressed simply, tying her scarf firmly, her eyes steady in the mirror though her hands trembled as she adjusted her blouse. She placed the tickets in her bag, the evidence of his betrayal, and stepped out into the bustling streets. The Danfo ride to Murtala Muhammad International was suffocating, the driver swearing at traffic, passengers arguing over change, hawkers shoving goods at windows. Clara sat in silence, her thoughts louder than the chaos around her. She imagined James at the airport, smiling with Melissa, unaware that his carefully woven lies were about to unravel. Her heart ached with every beat, but her resolve did not falter. She was not going to scream or beg. She was going to stand tall and reclaim what was hers. As the airport came into view, its glass walls glinting under the sun, Clara whispered a final prayer. Not for love, not for reconciliation, but for strength. She stepped off the bus, her bag pressed against her side, and walked toward the terminal. Whatever happened next, she would no longer be the silent woman who bore betrayal in secret. James would see her, the world would see her, and the debt he owed would finally be paid. The airport was a hive of movement, a restless river of people flowing in every direction, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors like an endless drumbeat. Clara stepped through the wide glass doors into that ocean of bodies, her handbag pressed firmly against her side, her breath shallow but steady. The hum of the terminal was filled with sharp voices of travelers arguing over luggage weight, announcements calling out flight numbers, and the metallic clatter of trolleys pushed hurriedly across tiles. For a moment she felt invisible in the vastness of it all, just another face in the crowd, but inside her heart was a storm that made her grip the straps of her bag as though it contained her very soul. She scanned the departure hall, her eyes darting over families hugging goodbye, businessmen pacing with phones pressed to their ears, and children tugging at their mothers' skirts. Then she saw them. James walked in confidently, Melissa by his side, her hair bouncing as she laughed at something he whispered. They looked like a picture of ease, as if the world had conspired in their favor. Clara's stomach twisted at the sight, and she felt her knees weaken, but she planted her feet more firmly, grounding herself. She remembered the tickets in her bag, remembered the nights of hunger and debt she had endured for him, and her trembling turned to iron. She moved to the side, choosing a spot near the boarding gates, her body hidden among other waiting passengers, but her eyes locked on James like a predator studying its prey. Each step they took drew them closer to her, each sound of their laughter tightened the knot in her chest, until finally the distance between them and her was no more than a breath. James stopped in his tracks the moment his gaze collided with hers. The blood drained from his face, leaving his smile frozen halfway, his hand loosening in Melissa's grip as though her touch had suddenly burned him. The clamor of the airport seemed to dim in that instant, the announcements becoming a muffled hum, the footsteps fading to background noise. Clara stood tall, her expression calm, her voice low but sharp enough to cut the air when she said his name. James! Melissa blinked, her laughter dying in her throat as she looked from Clara to James, confusion flickering across her features. The silence between the three of them stretched painfully, broken only when Clara reached into her bag and pulled out the folded tickets. She held them up, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. "You thought you would leave me behind," she said, her words quiet but carrying a weight that made nearby travelers slow their steps. "You thought the money I spent to save your life would vanish like dust." James opened his mouth, stammering something about explanations, but the sight of the tickets in her hand silenced him. Melissa turned sharply, her brow furrowing, and demanded to know what Clara meant. Clara did not raise her voice. Instead, she unfolded receipts from the hospital, papers showing payments and loans, each document a blade cutting deeper into James's facade. "I sold what I had. I begged from those who had little. All to save him," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "And this is how he thanks me? By running away with you?" The words fell heavy, echoing beyond the circle of onlookers who now gathered, drawn to the unfolding drama, as though it were a play staged just for them. The weight of exposure pressed on James like a stone wall. He reached for Clara's arm, desperation flashing in his eyes, but she pulled back sharply, her voice steadier than it had ever been. "No more lies. No more begging for love that should have been mine freely." Melissa stepped back, her face twisted in shock as she pieced the story together. She turned on James with an expression of disgust, her voice rising. "Is this true? She paid for your surgery? She carried your burden, and you were going to leave her?" The surrounding crowd murmured, whispers spreading like wildfire, eyes fixed on James as though he were a criminal caught in broad daylight. He tried to speak, but his words tangled in his throat, each attempt collapsing under the weight of truth. Clara, standing firm in the middle of the terminal, looked at him with eyes stripped of affection, her calmness more frightening than any scream could have been. "You will return every kobo," she said coldly. "Every naira I spent to save you. Right here. Right now." James's hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, the crowd's murmur growing louder, security officers edging closer, their eyes sharp but patient, waiting to intervene if the scene erupted. Clara did not flinch. She waited, her arms crossed, the receipts spread in her hand like cards in a game she had already won. For once, she was not the pleading lover, but the judge delivering sentence. Defeat came slowly, visibly, as James lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumping, and the arrogance that once colored his steps drained from him. In that crowded terminal, under the bright fluorescent lights, he transferred the money back to Clara's account, his fingers clumsy as he entered the details on his phone. The confirmation message buzzed into her own device, and she stared at it for a long second, the proof that her sacrifice had been reclaimed. She looked at him one last time, not with rage, not with longing, but with a quiet finality that closed the chapter of their story. Melissa shook her head in disbelief, stepping away from him as though his very presence had become poison. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though their whispers lingered, spreading across the terminal like ripples on water. Clara slipped the papers back into her bag and turned away without another word. Her heart still carried scars, but her dignity had returned, her strength shining in the steadiness of her steps. James called out her name, his voice trembling, but she did not pause, did not grant him the mercy of a glance. The glass doors slid open as she stepped out into the night air, the hum of Lagos greeting her like an old friend, and she walked forward, free at last from the chains of betrayal, her spirit steady despite the ache in her chest. The airport behind her faded into noise, but her resolve remained, strong as iron forged in fire. The night outside the airport was alive with its own rhythm, cars honking impatiently on the expressway, vendors calling out to travelers rushing home, and the air carrying the heavy scent of roasted corn from roadside stands. Clara walked slowly into that buzzing Lagos night, the noise of the terminal fading behind her as if it belonged to another world. Her heart pounded still, not from fear but from the weight of what had just ended. She had stood in front of the man she once loved, the man she once believed her future depended on, and reclaimed what was rightfully hers. The ache in her chest was sharp, but beneath it was a strange calmness, the kind that comes after a storm has broken every branch yet left the earth washed clean. She hailed a cab and slid into the back seat, clutching her handbag to her side. The driver, an elderly man with gray in his beard, looked at her in the mirror but did not speak. Perhaps he sensed the heaviness she carried, or perhaps he was too tired to ask. As they drove through the city's lit highways, Clara leaned her head against the window, watching neon signs blur past, night markets closing their stalls, and lovers strolling along sidewalks hand in hand. Once, such sights would have filled her with longing, but now they were simply reminders that life went on, indifferent to broken hearts or reclaimed debts. By the time the cab stopped outside her Surrey apartment, Clara felt as though she had traveled much farther than a simple ride could measure. She stepped out, paid the fare, and climbed the stairs to her flat, each step carrying her away from the shadow of James and closer to herself. Inside her small room, the silence greeted her like an old friend. The familiar hum of her neighbor's generator filtered through the thin walls, and the air smelled faintly of kerosene from her own lamp. Clara set her bag on the table and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the sewing machine that had waited patiently in the corner all these months. Its metal gleamed dully under the weak light, a reminder of the dreams she once put aside to care for a man who had proven unworthy. Slowly, she reached for it, running her fingers across its surface as if reacquainting herself with a long-lost companion. She thought of the nights she had starved to gather hospital fees, of the mornings she had borrowed fabric money just to buy his medication, of the humiliating moments when she begged from people she barely knew. Each sacrifice had once seemed like an investment in a shared tomorrow, but that tomorrow had dissolved like mist under the Lagos sun. And yet, Clara realized she was still here. She had not disappeared with James. She had not been erased by his betrayal. The scars remained, but so did her strength. She threaded the needle carefully, her hands steady, and began to stitch a simple cloth she had abandoned weeks ago. The rhythmic sound of the machine filled the room, a melody that reminded her of her own resilience. In that small act, she reclaimed more than money. She reclaimed herself. Days turned into weeks, and Lagos continued its relentless pace, the city moving as if nothing monumental had happened. For Clara, however, everything had shifted. She no longer waited for James's calls, no longer rushed to cook for him after long hours at the shop, no longer rearranged her dreams to fit his whims. She poured her energy back into her work, designing new outfits, gaining new clients, and slowly building a name for herself among tailors in her neighborhood. Her laughter, once rare and hidden, began to surface again in conversations with friends and customers. Sometimes at night, when she walked through her area, she caught the sounds of music spilling from bars, the chatter of couples arm in arm, and though a pang of loneliness touched her, it did not consume her. She told herself that solitude was not emptiness but space, space for healing, for growth, for rediscovering parts of herself she had buried. She no longer prayed for James to return or for Melissa to vanish. She prayed instead for clarity, for strength, for peace that no man could steal. The betrayal still stung when she remembered it, but it was no longer a wound bleeding freely. It was a scar, firm and quiet, reminding her of the danger of giving without boundaries. She learned to smile at her own reflection, not because everything was perfect, but because she had survived what was meant to break her. Months later, when word reached her that James had lost his job at the garage, and that Melissa had left him not long after the airport disgrace, Clara felt no joy in his downfall. She did not laugh, she did not gloat. She simply shook her head and went back to her sewing. For she had come to understand that revenge is not always in watching another suffer, but in living well despite their betrayal. One evening, as she sat by her window watching the city lights flicker like restless stars, she reflected on the strange journey life had taken her on. She had started as a woman who believed love was worth any sacrifice, and she had been broken by the harsh reality that not all hearts are honest. But through the breaking, she had found something deeper than love, resilience. Clara whispered to herself, "I am enough," and the city outside seemed to echo her words in its unending hum. She leaned back in her chair, the cloth she had been stitching resting neatly on her lap, and allowed a faint smile to spread across her lips. Though the road behind her was lined with pain, the one ahead was hers alone, and it stretched wide open under the restless skies of Lagos. My friends, this story reminds us that love without wisdom can cost more than money. It can cost peace, time, and even dignity. Be careful where you plant your sacrifices, because not every soil will grow fruits of gratitude. Learn to value yourself, and don't be afraid to walk away from those who abuse your kindness. May you never invest your sweat, your tears, and your sacrifices into the hands of those who will turn around and betray you. Amen. May your heart never be broken by the very people you lifted when they were down. Amen. May God bless you with discernment to see people's true colors before you give too much. Amen. May your kindness never be wasted, and may your good deeds return to you multiplied in joy, peace, and abundance. Amen. And may every hand that rises to take advantage of you be exposed, disgraced, and removed from your life. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.